So now it's time to continue our decade series, and I'm going to talk about my favorite movie from every year of the 1950s.
Hey, I think it'll work.
Of course.
It's a cinch. You know, it may be crazy, but we're gonna do it.
Hey folks, welcome to the Cobwebs channel where we're dusting off old movies. My name is Daniel, and yes, I've been going through a series, as you know, talking about my favorite movie of the 1930s, 1940s, and now today, of the 1950s. The 1950s was an incredible decade for film. Despite what some people will tell you, I do think some people have an idea of 1950s movies that really comes from 1950s television. They think it's all Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, just pushing a lot of squeaky cleanness and just not a lot of depth or a lot of darkness there. And that couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to 1950s film. There's so many great movies of so many different kinds, and I want to talk to you about some of my very favorites. One thing that I've been enjoying so much about this series is hearing your favorite movie of every single year of this decade. So let me know down in the comments below or hit me up on social media. What's your favorite movie from every year of the 1950s? Let me know your list so we can talk about these movies. Let's get started. Kicking off with 1950, I do want to give a shout out to Billy Wilder because he put out Sunset Boulevard this year, one of the great movies about Hollywood. Then there's also The Gunfighter, one of my favorite kind of underrated dark westerns with Gregory Peck. And I'll be honest, if I had seen it more recently, I might have picked All About Eve because I had an amazing time watching All About Eve with Bette Davis. I just haven't seen it in years, and I didn't get a chance to rewatch it before making this video, but that is an incredible film. But for this video, I'm going to talk about a movie that impacted me so much, and that is In a Lonely Place, starring Humphrey Bogart. It's directed by Nicholas Ray, one of my favorite classic film directors, and it's about Humphrey Bogart, who is a screenwriter in Hollywood, who is the last person seen with a girl who gets murdered. So obviously he becomes a suspect, and we as the audience going through the movie don't actually know if he did it or not. He begins a romance with Gloria Graham, one of my favorite actresses, especially of the film noir genre. We really like their relationship. They're cute together. They seem good together, but the whole time we don't know, is this guy guilty of murder? What we do know is that he has a terrible temper, and that causes a lot of friction between him and Gloria Graham, and she wonders, is it possible my boyfriend killed this girl? It's a great black and white noir filled with everything you want out of the genre. Brutal intensity, great romance, even some humor. It's just such a full experience, and maybe has one of the most impactful endings I've ever seen. My God, it is such a gut punch. For 1951, I do want to shout out another movie I haven't seen in a few years, but I remember loving, and that's The African Queen, again with Humphrey Bogart, but paired with Katharine Hepburn. Then also The Thing from Another World is one of my favorite of those 50s sci-fi movies. But for 51, I'm going to end up giving it to Billy Wilder this time for Ace in the Hole, starring Kirk Douglas. This is one of the darkest and most cynical movies about the newspaper business. It is starring Kirk Douglas as a reporter who's just feeling stuck working for this newspaper, and he ends up using the story of a man who gets trapped in a cave to revitalize his career and turns it into this huge media circus that it honestly doesn't need to be, just in order to give himself personal success. And this is a story of watching a horrible person just degrade himself to darker and darker levels of immorality, down to just making the situation even worse just to keep the story better.
Phony, below the belt journalism, that's what it is. Not below the belt, right in the gut, Mr. Booth.
Kirk Douglas is an actor that I like, but an actor that I believe the most when he's playing scumbags. I think that's where he's best, and he is fantastic as this very charismatic but very evil scumbag. Ace in the Hole is a great, very intense movie that I highly recommend. All right, let's lighten things up with 1952. Now, if I want to do shout outs, I could give it to a couple of great westerns. Bend of the River, maybe my favorite of the Jimmy Stewart, Anthony Mann collaborations, and High Noon, of course, the movie that Gary Cooper won an Oscar for. But there is no question in my mind, there is no debate whatsoever for me that my favorite movie in 1952 is Singing in the Rain, which is possibly my favorite musical of all time, definitely my favorite Gene Kelly musical. And I love Gene Kelly. He's such an athletic performer, one of the greatest dancers that ever graced the silver screen. It's a period piece that takes place in the 1920s about the transition from silent films to talkies, and the movie pokes a lot of fun at Hollywood for how awkward that transition was, and there's a lot of fantastic comedy the movie gets out of that. This is a hilarious movie. It's actually a rare old classic film that I did get the chance to see in a theater once, and it's one of the funniest experiences I've ever had in a movie theater, not just for me, but for the audience around me. Everybody was gut-busting laughing throughout this thing. So it's so funny, but all of the songs are great, the music is so good, and the title sequence, Singing in the Rain, of Gene Kelly singing in the rain, is one of my favorite sequences in any movie ever. Just a personal favorite for me. But also you got to give a shout out to Donald O'Connor, right, for Make 'Em Laugh, which is incredible as well. In 1953, the first great Vincent Price horror film came out, House of Wax. I'm a huge fan of Vincent Price and House of Wax. But you've also got From Here to Eternity, a great military melodrama starring Burt Lancaster, and of course The Big Heat, great Fritz Lang noir film. But let's keep it light, because from 1953, I'm going to go with my favorite being Roman Holiday, starring Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn. This is a movie with an almost fairy tale-like premise, even though it takes place in present day, about a princess who escapes the palace walls because she just wants some freedom. She wants to get away from all the stuffiness of that and wants to pretend to be an ordinary girl and see the sights around Rome. She ends up meeting a reporter played by Gregory Peck who learns her secret but goes along with it because he realizes this could actually be a really great story. So it's a much lighter and more fun movie about newspapers exploiting a situation. And there ends up being a romance between Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. It's a rare time that Audrey Hepburn did not get paired with an old man.
It's most unusual.
This is maybe my favorite use of Audrey Hepburn, and I love the romance between her and Gregory Peck. This is just such a fun and whimsical movie. It's around 2 hours long, which is a little bit unusually long for a romantic comedy from this period. And maybe you feel it at times, but I just think it has so many iconic sequences of the genre and one of the greatest and most impactful endings. I think that's one thing that really sets apart my favorite movies of the year from just movies I love, is an ending that really sticks out of my head and just hits me in the gut. And I just think, wow, that is a great movie that ended in the perfect way. Maybe not the way that exactly I would have picked for these characters, but the ending that is right. And that's a great example right here in Roman Holiday. All right, for 1954, I might lose a little bit of credibility, but I gotta be honest, because Akira Kurosawa put out Seven Samurai in 1954, which I do love and I think is amazing. I've only seen it once. It's 4 hours long, but it is amazing. But then you got a couple of great Hitchcock movies with Rear Window and Dial M for Murder. And speaking of foreign films, Godzilla over in Japan as well. But I'm going with my heart here. You guys know how much I love the Universal monsters. I'm going with The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I love this movie so much. It is a great monster movie. And in fact, I think it holds the greatest guy in a suit monster in any movie ever, especially if you watch a lot of 1950s monster movies, which I have. They're charming, they're fun, I'm a fan, but so many of them have really bad looking monsters, and that's fine. That's part of the charm. Like, I really enjoy that. But The Creature from the Black Lagoon, I don't think there's anything dated about how this creature looks. It is a masterful work of art, both in the design and the execution, the performers of the actors in the suit. This is a fully realized creature that just blows me away. I think this movie also has a better cast of stronger actors than a lot of 50s sci-fi movies. Special shout out, of course, to Julie Adams. She maybe isn't playing like the most deep character, but is such a wonderfully charming presence. And you've got to shout out the scene where her and the creature are swimming together. It's just one of the most beautiful, maybe romantic scenes in all of movies, if you want to take it that way. This is just a great adventure movie. It's a great movie about that science versus business argument where you've got the scientist who just wants to leave the creature that they bothered alone. You've got the businessman who wants the big game hunt, who just wants to hunt this thing down, even though he doesn't. That's not a fight that needs to be had, but if it's going to be had, the creature is going to go for it. A great monster movie. Like I said, I do love 50s monster movies, and this might be the very best of them. 1955 saw the release of two of my favorite musicals of all time. It's Always Fair Weather with Gene Kelly, but also Guys and Dolls, an adaptation of one of my very favorite stage musicals of all time, starring Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra, Gene Simmons, and I love all of them. I know Marlon Brando's voice isn't the best, but I don't really care. I think he's great in the role. But also one of my favorite Ingmar Bergman movies, Smiles of a Summer Night, a rare time that he made a romantic comedy, and I think he just blew it out of the water. But 1955, I'm going to go with Charles Laughton's Night of the Hunter, starring Robert Mitchum. This is sort of a dark fairy tale-like movie in which it is about Robert Mitchum as a preacher and thief and serial killer, an incredibly dark character who finds out that his prison inmate who's on death row hid a bunch of money at his house. When Robert Mitchum gets out of prison, he goes to that guy's house and he tries to exploit the wife and kids for this money. Now, some people consider this a noir film. And I think if this was from the perspective of adults, it would be a crime noir film. But this movie is from the perspective of children, and I think that turns it into a monster movie. I do think the way Charles Laughton films this and presents the story, it feels like Robert Mitchum is a true movie monster. So I consider this a horror film. Charles Laughton, this is the only movie he directed. He never directed again, partially because he died too young, but also because this movie wasn't received well. But he watched a lot of silent films to prepare for this, and he wanted to bring the form of silent films, which is a more advanced filmmaking technique other than the absence of sound, and bring it to talkies. So this movie feels incredibly ahead of its time, modern. It's got so many of the coolest shots I've ever seen, especially in a black and white movie, but maybe just in a movie in general. It's a stunningly beautiful film. It's a spiritual film, both about the darkest side of religion and the side of it that brings people towards altruism. It's got those conflicting sides of religion, and it uses old hymns like Leaning on the Everlasting Arms for a sinister horror atmosphere. This is an incredible movie, a movie I didn't fully get the first time I saw it. I thought it was good, but upon rewatch, I think this is a masterful classic of the 1950s. I love this movie, my favorite film of 1955. Now, for 1956, I'll be totally honest with you. This is, in my heart, this is a four-way tie. There are four movies that I feel like I love equally, because my favorite Douglas Sirk melodrama, and I do like Douglas Sirk movies a lot, my favorite one came out this year. That's There's Always Tomorrow, starring Barbara Stanwyck. A little bit underseen. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is my favorite version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I know a lot of people go with this remake or that remake. I still think the original is the best. Stanley Kubrick. I love his film, The Killing, which is... Stanley Kubrick is such a masterful director, and he so often uses his talents towards things that are very high concept. I love seeing him use his skill towards a simple noir heist film and just execute it as perfectly as you can execute that kind of film. But I'm going to go with the one that I feel the most strongly about in my heart right now, and that is John Ford's The Searchers, starring John Wayne. The Searchers is the story of a Confederate soldier right after the Civil War ends, Ethan, played by John Wayne, who goes back to his brother's house and his family. And when a tribe of Native Americans attacks their house and kills most of the family, but abducts the two daughters, John Wayne and the suitor to one of the girls go on a long, epic, decades-long quest to rescue these girls. Now, that premise makes this sound like a fairly simple search and rescue kind of movie, but it's anything but. This movie is an incredibly morally complicated film. It has John Wayne starring in a very dark role. John Ford often used John Wayne in a bit more simple ways, but he saw Red River, which was directed by Howard Hawks back in the 1940s, and he thought, wow, John Wayne actually can act, so he really used John Wayne's acting chops, probably the most he ever did in this film. And Ethan is an anti-hero. He's not a good guy, but he's also doing this good thing to save these girls, but does he even want to save them? Does he actually just want to kill them because they've been living with the Native Americans? It's complicated.
What do you want me to do, draw you a picture? Spell it out!
It's a movie that you can really dig into, but I think at the end of the day, it's a gorgeous movie. It's exciting, it's thrilling, it's funny at times. It's a completely full experience at the movies, and I'm a big fan of John Wayne, actually. I find that the older I get, I know I'm still fairly young, but the older I get, I'm becoming more and more of a fan of him. And this is maybe his best performance he ever gave. For 1957, I could just give you a top 10. So many amazing directors put out great movies this year. Stanley Kubrick with Paths of Glory. Billy Wilder with Witness for the Prosecution. Bud Boetticher, I would consider Bud Boetticher a great director, with The Tall T. Sidney Lumet with 12 Angry Men, which I feel like most people would go with 12 Angry Men. That is an incredible film. But I know I would be lying. And people who followed me for a long time would know I would be lying if I didn't pick Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein, directed by Terence Fisher.
You're not going to intimidate me. I'm entitled to my opinion.
Look, there's just no question this is the movie I've watched the most from this year. This is the movie that means the most to me. I am a huge fan of Hammer, and I picked a lot of Universal monsters up to this point, which I've loved, but now that we're getting into the Hammer films, expect a lot of Hammer talk from here on out, because they're one of my favorite studios of all time, possibly my favorite kind of horror film, and The Curse of Frankenstein is their first attempt to revive the gothic horror films of the 1930s and 40s. They were not allowed to use anything that Universal had created from the Frankenstein story, so they could only adapt the Mary Shelley novel and go their own way. This ends up being an even even less faithful to the novel version than Universal did, which is really saying something, but they completely go their own direction. They use the doctor as the main character and not the monster, and make the movie so much about the process, the grueling process of this sociopath, really, creating a human out of dead body parts. For its time, this was an incredibly graphic and gory film. It really pushed the boundaries of horror. A movie with one of my favorite performances in the genre, with Peter Cushing. Christopher Lee, I love as the Frankenstein monster. He could not be more different, almost couldn't be more different from Boris Karloff, but I think he completely makes the creature his own as this just sad, pathetic, wounded animal. Feels less of a human than Karloff did, and I think that was a really interesting direction to take it. I just love The Curse of Frankenstein so much. It's my favorite Hammer movie. I love Hammer. Has to be my favorite film of 1957. 1958, another incredible year for horror films. Hammer did put out Horror of Dracula this year, and also the original The Fly with Vincent Price, which is another movie that I really love. You want to talk about Westerns? The Big Country came out with Gregory Peck. Love that movie. Man of the West with Gary Cooper, and just one of the darkest 1950s Westerns. I love that film too. But I'm going to go with Alfred Hitchcock with Vertigo, one of my absolute favorite of his movies. This tells the story of Jimmy Stewart as an ex-police detective who is suffering from a severe fear of heights. Vertigo.
Well, it's a cinch. Here, I look up, I look down, I look up, I look...
And he's hired by an old college friend to follow his wife, who he believes is possessed by the spirit of her dead grandmother. And Jimmy Stewart, along the way, uncovers a very dark mystery and becomes dangerously obsessed with the man's wife, played by Kim Novak. Visually, this is probably Alfred Hitchcock's most experimental film. Whether you want to talk about Kim Novak coming out of the haze out of the bathroom, the animation sequence, just the incredibly vivid colors. Much like Night of the Hunter, I watch this movie and I feel like I'm being exposed to so many of the greatest shots in all of cinema. It's a stunning movie visually, but thematically, it's maybe the quintessential film about obsession, and it takes that obsession so far into such dark places that it makes me uncomfortable. This is the only movie where I find Jimmy Stewart scary. I think this is Alfred Hitchcock's scariest movie, even though it's maybe not as explicitly horror as something he would make a couple of years later. But also it's very complicated, because in the past, I always just find myself scared by Jimmy Stewart and finding him to be a massive creep, which in so many ways he is. But his most recent watch, I also found myself feeling very sorry for him as a victim in this pretty horrible plot that he does uncover in this movie. It's a movie, not even just with gray characters, with very dark gray characters. Everyone is pretty horrible, but I'm so fascinated throughout. It's not one of the most rewatchable movies of the year, I'll be honest with you. It's not a movie I watch a lot, but that's because of how impactful it truly is. So I do love Vertigo, one of my favorite Hitchcock movies. I've got to say it's the best movie of 1958. 1959. So speaking of Hitchcock, he put out North by Northwest this year, spy thriller starring Cary Grant, another one of my favorite of his movies. But we've been talking a lot about Billy Wilder, and Billy Wilder put out Some Like It Hot this year, another one of my favorites. Speaking of horror, I'd be lying if I didn't say House on Haunted Hill is one of the movies that I rewatched the most from this year. Classic Vincent Price camp, but this was another easy one for me. One of my favorite classic films of all time. That's Rio Bravo, directed by Howard Hawks, again starring John Wayne. I love John Wayne Westerns when they're great. And The Searchers and Rio Bravo, some of the best. This is about John Wayne as Sheriff John T. Chance, who arrests the brother of a powerful rancher for murder. And he knows that rancher is coming with his men to get this guy out of prison by any means necessary. And it ends up being a siege movie, but most of it is more of a hangout movie. Just John, along with Dean Martin, Walter Brennan, and Angie Dickinson, just kind of hanging out, waiting for this impending action to happen. John Wayne is great in this movie, but he happens to be surrounded by, I think, two of the best supporting performances in the entire genre. That is Dean Martin as John Wayne's deputy, who is a recovering drunk, still a drunk, who's trying to be better, and he's really the heart of this movie. He's a sad character, but that you really want to see succeed. And then Angie Dickinson as John Wayne's love interest, who almost like forces John Wayne kicking and screaming into a romance that he doesn't necessarily want to happen, but she's like, hey buddy, this is happening.
What I had to go through, put on these tights, ask a lot of questions, start to walk out, I thought you were never gonna say it.
Say what?
That you loved me.
I said I'd arrest you.
It means the same thing. You know that. You just won't say it.
And she is a classic Howard Hawks woman, like straight out of His Girl Friday or something, and into this Western. And I think she's amazing in the movie. I love the dialogue. I love the whole vibe of it. I love the singing sequence, because Ricky Nelson's also in this movie, and him and Dean Martin singing in the jail. One of my favorite scenes in any Western. I love Rio Bravo so much. Gotta be my favorite movie of 1959. So that's it, everyone. My favorite movie of every year of the 1950s. Please let me know down in the comments, if you haven't yet, what is your favorite movie of every single year of the 1950s. Give a like if you enjoyed this video, and a subscribe for more videos like this, because the video on my favorite movie of every year of the 1960s is going to be coming up very soon. 1960s, another just incredible decade of movies. That's going to be a tough list to make. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.